Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. Ever wonder why the potholes on our roads never get fixed? Or why programs for public school kids continue to get cut? Or why there's a shortage of police officers and firefighters in your city, even as you pay higher and higher taxes? It's because your tax dollars are going to pay for the very generous pensions of government retirees. It's like supporting another vast phantom workforce. Now, most private sector employees know that when their companies aren't doing well, they can expect their employers to reduce their benefits. Not California workers, because the state is constitutionally bound to pay out all pension benefits during both economic booms and busts. In this episode, David Crane, businessman, educator, and self-described policy wonk, has made it his mission to fix the pension crisis in the state. PRI's Director of Communications, Tim Anaya, sat down with David Crane before a talk he gave at PRI's Young Leaders Circle at the Maritime Wine Club in San Francisco.
David Crane, welcome to our podcast. I really appreciate your coming on. For our listeners, David and I worked together in the Schwarzenegger administration way back in the day when we were mere children, maybe. Maybe not every one of our listeners is familiar with you and your background and your story. So I think if people went on your website and kind of read your bio, they might say, you're not really out of central casting as someone who's really become the California, crusader for reform. So maybe you could share with our listeners a little bit of your journey from the business world to this crazy political world.
Well, Tim, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's nice to see you again. So I spent 25 years in business, and I always planned to go into politics in some fashion. Public policy was my interest and my avocation when I was young, and as I got older, I just wanted to spend enough time in business so that we could make some money and be secure in our family. I ended up spending more time than I thought I would, and finally retired when I turned 50. It was my great luck that Arnold Schwarzenegger threw his hat in the ring during the recall election that year, and I ended up in his administration. Even though I happen to be a Democrat, I'm a member of a different party. There aren't that many issues that we don't see eye to eye on, especially state issues. And I thought I knew a lot before I got up there, and I learned that I knew next to nothing about the way things really work. And the biggest surprise to me was something that shouldn't have been surprising. Number one, the legislature is a co-equal branch of government. And that's the way it should be. It actually comes in the California Constitution before the executive branch, just like at the federal level. The other thing that I discovered was that there weren't that many Democrats up there like me. Most of the Democrats I met were very closely tied in with the government employee unions and a lot of healthcare corporations and others who were the biggest beneficiaries of state spending. And then the other thing I learned is that very few of those legislators were responsive to citizens. They were very responsive to special interests, and it's understandable why, because they're the ones most active up there. And so I resolved, once I got up there and I spent a few years and learned the way it works, to help the governor change the rules under which people are elected to the legislature, and then to establish an organization to help finance high-quality legislative candidates. And that's what Govern for California is, which is my current organization.
Could you share with our listeners a little bit of kind of why you started your organization and some of the things that you do and some of the impact that you've already had in Sacramento?
Sure. Well, and I also teach at Stanford, where I teach California policy and politics, healthcare policy and reform, and then this spring a new class on winning elections. And I really love policy a lot. So it's a good marriage between teaching and writing on issues and helping good people win and helping them stay in office. I discovered democracy is a very fragile thing. And in our state of 40 million people, which is governed by 120 people who this year will spend close to $300 billion and oversee the education of 9 million K through university students, and they write the education code, the criminal code, the business and professions code, the environmental code. And, under our federalist system, states are responsible for 90% of domestic services. I was blown away spending time in Sacramento by how little they focused on the interests of citizens. And when you study why, it's because even the most well-meaning legislator, when they get up there, is generally surrounded by people who fall into one of three categories. Either those who get paid by the state, and 70 cents of every one of those $300 billion goes out in comp and benefits, or health spending. So those groups spend a lot of time there. Corporations who don't want to be regulated to their detriment, Chevron among others, they know the name of every legislator. And all these associations, there's a lot of crony capitalism. The Dental Association, very careful about making sure they get legislators to do their bidding. The California Medical Association regularly quarrels with the Nurse Practitioners Association over scope of practice. The Real Estate Association, the Pawnbrokers Association, all those people have a greater influence over legislation than ordinary citizens, who are most of the 40 million people. So I resolved that could only change if good legislators, I'm talking about Abe Lincoln type legislators here, which I'll come back to in a second, know that they have someone that has their back and is as business oriented about electing them and keeping them elected and supporting them as are all the government employee unions, the healthcare corporations, and the association. And that's what Govern for California is. We're a network of political philanthropists. We are now the largest financier of candidates for the state legislature other than the parties themselves. Even though we're headed by a Democrat, we are the largest funder. We were the largest bundler for Republican candidates in 2016. And we think there is no greater devotion for our money and our time than helping state legislators govern for the people. And I actually do think the legislature in California is getting much better on a daily basis now for reasons we can discuss.
So I know one area where we can really use some courage is reforming our pension system. And I know you've written and lectured extensively on our pension crisis. For our listeners who may not have really followed the issue, can you give us a snapshot? Just how bad are the state's pensions problems?
Well, first of all, defined benefit plans, which is what the state offers its employees, can work perfectly fine, and they do. So, for example, at Berkshire Hathaway, where Warren Buffett is chairman, they have a very large defined benefit program where they have about $15 billion in liabilities, and they've properly set aside about $12 billion to meet those liabilities. And the relationship between the growth of those liabilities and the growth of the assets works so that they are completely safely funded. So they can work fine, and they can be beautiful for people. Retirement security is a big issue, and you want people to feel secure in those years. So these things work fine if people are on it. When Governor Schwarzenegger appointed me to the board of the California State Teachers Retirement System in 2005, I had no idea that they were basically lying about the math. They're reporting the liabilities at about half their true size, and they're reporting the earnings rate on the assets in the future at much higher than they will ever earn. And that automatically creates an enormous deficit. And I innocently said to my fellow board members in 2005, we have a problem here. We have to boost contributions now. Not even that much, but boost contributions now by using a reasonable investment return assumption. If you don't, you will have massive deficits in public schools in California in a decade. The legislature responded by kicking me off that board after 11 months. And they didn't address the problem. They kept lying about the math. They didn't set aside enough money. And the net result is today we have a massive problem in schools and elsewhere with this following result. We are in the 8th year of a bull market. We've had a 30% income tax increase. Revenues are way up in California, and school revenues are way up. San Francisco Unified School District, where this interview is taking place, their revenues are up roughly 60% over the last 5 years, I think. Yet they're able to spend only 29% of their budget this year on compensation for teachers. Only 29% of their budget. Now, schools are all about compensating teachers. Only 29%. And why is that? Because they're spending to meet these unfunded retirement promises more than doubled over the last 5 years to $100 million a year. That essentially removes $35 million this year from the $200+ million budget they have there that they could otherwise be spending on teacher compensation. And that means they don't have enough teachers in the classroom. There are too few teachers for the classroom size, and they can't pay those teachers enough. That is the essence of a pension crisis. And yet it's not like there's a bankruptcy because they can't go bankrupt. What it translates into is fewer teachers for kids and teachers who don't get paid enough, right? The net result of that is California spends about $2,000 more per student than Texas does, yet poor and minority students in Texas outperform poor and minority students in California. And why? Because they have a lot more teachers and specialists. The ratio is much better there for their student population, and they can dismiss teachers that aren't as good more quickly.
You recently wrote a column that I thought was really interesting, where you distinguished between the pension problems at the state level and those at the city, county, and we're testing the knowledge of our listeners, special district level. So describe the pension problem at the local level. What do taxpayers who live in these jurisdictions have in store for them if their local officials don't act soon on pension reform?
Well, the easiest way to answer that question, Tim, is to start with the way it works at the state. So an employee who works for the state will get paid their pension no matter what. For example, the money set aside to meet pensions that are owed to, let's say, DMV workers at the state or prison guards who are paid by the state. CalPERS, who manages that money, they could lose every penny tomorrow, which they won't. But if they did, those employees would still get their pensions because they are guaranteed by the taxpayers unconditionally. And the state has the power to tax, so it's like a general obligation bond, but even senior to that. At the local level and special districts like water districts, there is no such guarantee. They can actually declare bankrupt. So for example, if you work for the Marin Water District and money is set aside to meet your pension due you in the future, and they haven't set aside enough, and then they are unable to meet their obligations and they declare bankruptcy, you can lose your pension. So employees who work for enterprises that can declare bankruptcy have a much greater risk that their pension won't be paid to them. And they, more than state employees, should be paying close attention to how well funded the pensions are that are owed them by those local governments and school districts. When Stockton went broke, they ended up not cutting back their pensions, but they got rid of their retiree health care plan, which is another very important benefit for the employees who had done nothing wrong, and they lost those benefits. And these are not people that are rich who lost their retiree health care at a terrible time in their lives. That wouldn't have happened if that was properly funded. What it means for citizens is also different. At the state level, the state cannot declare bankruptcy. So what happens as it continues to pay more on pensions, it ends up spending less on other services. That explains why at the state level in California, the share of the budget this year going to the University of California is about 14 or 15% less than it was a decade ago. Revenues are way up, but they're only getting about $200 million more than they got a decade ago. The reason is the state's spending about 80% more on pensions and retiree health care. And that money then comes out of services. Those services principally hurt by increased spending at the state level are the University of California, California State University, parks, courts, and social services. Now at the local level, since they can declare bankruptcy, the same thing happens to citizens. The cities gradually perform fewer services. In LA, they don't repair sidewalks very often. That's why the mayor, Garcetti there, has gotten attention about that, criticism about that, and is devoting some money to that now. Streets don't get repaired as much, trees trimmed, etc. But it can also mean they cut back police forces and fire forces, and that's what happened in San Jose. But eventually, citizens get relief when, sadly, that local jurisdiction declares bankruptcy. So when Stockton declared bankruptcy and Vallejo declared bankruptcy, that was actually a relief for citizens, because up to that point in time, they were just seeing fewer and fewer services. When they declare bankruptcy, all of a sudden the creditors, both those on Wall Street and the employees due pension benefits, are put at bay, at least briefly. So that's the different impact on local citizens. But in both cases, what unfunded pensions and unfunded retiree health care mean is less of their tax dollars are going to services.
Our listeners have not heard this are probably scratching their heads and saying, what can we do to solve this problem? So if you were made king for a day in Sacramento, what one or two reforms would you enact that you believe would have the biggest impact in getting our pension problems under control?
Well, if I really had a magic wand, the first thing I would do is go back in time and convince the legislature in 2005 and 6 to reduce their investment return assumption and boost the contributions. Because if they had done that, if they had simply assumed a 6.2% investment return assumption, then they wouldn't have a problem today. But instead, they kept their investment return assumption too high, which means they kept their contributions too low, and that's why they have several $100 billion of liabilities that are now going to come out of government budgets. But since I can't, even with my magic wand, go back in time, the next thing I would do is the following, and this is cruel because of what it means. Taxpayers have already paid a price here. Taxpayers have seen their taxes go up and they're spending more money, they're paying more, tax rates are up, etc., yet the money isn't making it to services because it's going to fund unfunded pensions and retiree health care. Teachers and other current employees are not getting the salary increases that they would have otherwise gotten if these liabilities weren't in place, because the money that could have gone to their salary increases is going to pay unfunded liabilities for retirees. New employees who haven't been hired because of the same thing have suffered a negative consequence. Students have suffered a negative consequence because they're getting fewer services. Students have fewer teachers in their classrooms, and also all of us have had getting fewer services. Here in San Francisco, they used to clean the streets every week. They only do it every 2 weeks now, that sort of thing. It's a little bit like a frog slowly being boiled to death and not realizing it. So everybody has suffered a negative consequence with the exception of one group. Even new employees who are going to work for government have suffered a cost because they get smaller pensions going forward. Only group that hasn't suffered any pain are current employees with respect to years they haven't yet worked and retirees. And when you now at this stage, since the pension obligations are so big and crowding out spending so much, you have to cut benefits, unearned benefits for current employees and for retirees, which is what they did, for example, in Rhode Island, which is the only state that's really done serious pension reform. Under a Democratic governor, Gina Raimondo, they reduced the cost of living adjustment for retirees and they reduced the benefits for current employees with respect to years they haven't yet worked. And they saved a lot of money doing that.
So there's a big legal question that's being debated in California's courtroom today. So what are your thoughts on these legal challenges and the prospects for achieving reform through the courts if we can't achieve it through the legislature?
It's very important to understand the way defined benefit pension plans work in the private sector under ERISA, under federal law. If Tim Anaya goes to work or went to work for IBM, 20 years ago, and they promised him a pension, a defined benefit pension, and he planned on working there for, let's say, 40 years, and he earned at a certain rate for 20 years, if they then decided at IBM, well, you know what, Tim, it's tough now, we're not going to pay the same level of benefit going forward. You will keep everything you've earned, but for the next 20 years that you're working here, the benefit will be slightly lower. That's completely the way, that's illegal under ERISA. That's the way it works everywhere else. In California, the position taken by leaders of government employee unions and others is that, no. Tim gets the benefit that was promised him the day he joined, even if they drop it and even if he hasn't accrued it yet. So what they would say in that case is, Tim not only gets the benefit for the 20 years that he's actually earned, but you have to continue to pay him the same benefit for the following years, even though you could fire Tim and he would lose it all. If he's going to continue to work there, he will get the benefit that he was promised on day one. And that is not the way it works anywhere else. The case before the court challenges that so-called rule. And that rule is not statutory. That rule was in a court case about 55 or 60 years ago, and it wasn't even central to the ruling of that case. So California is going to have to put itself in a position where those employees should be treated like employees everywhere else and have the benefits that they've earned protected and be subject to an ability to reduce benefits for years not yet worked, including cost of living adjustment.
Legislators routinely give lip service about the need for pension reform, yet it seems like meaningful reforms are always blocked at the state capitol. The most recent reforms that were enacted a few years back, while positive, really most people think of those as baby steps at best. So in your view, what do you think it will take to finally break through the log jam and enact meaningful pension reform?
In my view, in California, what it will take is a few more legislators who recognize that this issue, which is really about financial unsustainability at the expense of innocent people, the most vulnerable people in our population, including children that are in public schools or will be in public schools, they're the ones that are hurt by this. So anybody who thinks, for example, that climate change is an issue affecting the future should have the same concern about this sort of financial unsustainability. And it's a massively serious issue. We're talking about the very real risk of civil disorder when governments can't field enough public safety personnel. Puerto Rico is a good example of that. They got hit by a storm, but they got hit by a financial storm before the storm they got hit by. And they therefore were and are in an incredibly weak position to address their own issues, even with federal assistance. Because that little province, that little commonwealth with 3 million people had built up like $75 billion worth of debt. Well, that's happening now in cities and counties and at the state of California, where the amount of money that is going to services is being cut back and citizens are paying more in taxes. And when that starts to affect them in a serious way, like police and fire protection, more people will start paying attention. But I really do think this is where it's all about leadership. This is where you are talking about Abe Lincoln. It's very hard for people to address financial issues like this in the absence of courageous leadership, which I think will show up in the California legislature. And this governor of Rhode Island is a good example of that. Her name is Gina Raimondo. She's a liberal Democrat who had realized that services were being destroyed for ordinary citizens and that had to be addressed.
I think what you say is very important about people getting involved and staying involved and really getting interested. I remember when you talked earlier about your appointment to that pension board, I remember watching your confirmation hearing. It was probably one of the greatest confirmation hearings in the history of confirmation hearings. But it should have, I hope it's on the internet somewhere and people can watch this, because every Californian should be outraged watching the things that legislators and others said at that hearing. And looking back now, you might have been a psychic during that hearing, because most of the things you said have pretty much come true.
Yeah, I mean, all of them have come true. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to understand the math associated with pensions, but the people that have been setting the rates for paying in on those pensions are self-serving and they're self-interested, and it's in their interest to keep investment return assumptions too high because it keeps their costs lower, which creates a bigger deficit for citizens. But it didn't take a genius to say you are assuming returns that you will never achieve, and that will create a massive deficit.
So after hearing all this depressing news, we might need a glass of wine. So here at PRI, we think wine is the perfect complement to discuss California policy ideas. So please share with our listeners your recommendation for maybe a favorite wine or other beverage that you recommend that they try.
Well, I'm also struck by the fact that as we're sitting in this magnificent wine bar as we discuss this, and we just had this massive fire, which apparently is still underway in the wine country in California, and which will change the crop apparently for years to come. Others would know more about that. I'm a red wine drinker, and I'm not somebody who remembers labels well, but I know something when it tastes good, when it tastes bad, and I find I love California California Pinot Noirs, but I also, to be quite honest, even though I like to favor California, I like those Pinots that come from the Willamette Valley in Oregon.
David Crane, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast today.
Tim, it was a pleasure to be here and nice to see you again.
Thanks again to our guest, David Crane, and to Tim Anaya. To stay up to date with David Crane, follow him on Twitter at David G. Crane. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Also, check out our new blog, Right by the Bay, on our website at pacificresearch.org. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.